Bergson and the Holographic Theory of Mind. Part 76, Biomemory, or a discussion on the discussion with Joscha Bach and Levin recently, which involves heavily the Planaria, who appear to be the future rulers of Earth, given their biological robustness. And in reality, what we'll see is the ongoing biodestruction of AI. So here we have a discussion between a brilliant biologist and a computer science guy. It takes place in this backdrop: the crumbling of the concept that the brain is a hardwired neural net, or the collapse of the hardwired synapse-based connectome, where we just have to map the connections and we understand what the brain knows. In truth, the crumbling of the computational metaphor, though JB will try to save this desperately. A younger, brilliant generation, this context, noticing paradigm-destroying experiments simply being left out of the textbooks. The usual ignorance, however, that there is a science, and is a science of perception, especially a radical but somewhat suppressed version in Gibson. At 32 minutes in, JB starts to set the context. He briefly mentions Planaria and going down a rabbit hole. Then a series of seemingly oblique points, obliquely related. Rotation, rotating an object, which is a large set of points to a slightly different angle. How do you have the same operator working throughout the brain, he asked. Computer scientists solve this using convolutional networks, making the same area with its procedure available everywhere, but this would be difficult with synapses, he notes. Babies, how they learn. Initially, they have much more connectivity than they need. Afterwards, they optimize. They get rid of parts of the neural structure, discarding the things they don't need to compute what they want to compute. Still in the JB, his points continued. The patterns of activation are completely stable in the brain. If you look, you'll find they might be moving the next day or rotated a little bit. Also difficult to do with synapses. You have a body map in your brain, but you have an accident and lose a finger. Someone gives you an artificial limb and you try to integrate this into your body map. How do you still shift all the representations around? How do you shift them all around? Make space for something else, that the neighborhoods are always correct and you don't need to realign everything. JB continues. All this is possible in a different paradigm. Take something I couldn't quite catch the name of the word seriously and go down this rabbit hole. Humans are now learning a local function over its neighbor. They are learning how to respond to something of an incoming activation front, a spatial temporal pattern in their neighborhood, and they are densely enough connected so the neighborhood is just a space around them. They interpret this space according to a certain topology. To say this may be a convolution that says, gives me 2 1/2 D or 2D or 1D or whatever, the type of function they want to compute, and they learn to fire. So JB is really talking about perception here, how we perceive the coffee cup on the table. Hidden in this, that's what he's truly trying to figure out, how this is going to happen within this massive biological mushiness and variability that he knows he's facing. So he says it's possible in a different paradigm, but he'll show no signs of actually giving up this paradigm. To continue, they learn to fire, to modulate the patterns, and are passed on. They store their responses to incoming signals, possibly in RNA. So RNA is really getting loaded if they're storing the responses to incoming signals, my lord. So you have storing the soma. You can make very cheaply. So if you have successful mixed states and they are useful computational primitives, they've discovered they can give these to other neurons or throughout the cortex. So humans of the same type will gain the knowledge to apply the same computational primitive. So he's speculating on how he can get all his computational modules or objects spread all over the brain in order to handle perceiving the coffee cup. And then he says, one of the rabbit holes I fell down when looking at neuroscience, but changing my thinking, In other words, he's going to really hit the mushiness is Planaria. At this point, Levin now steps in. He says, the original findings of Planaria was a guy named James McConnell in Michigan, early 60s, and really interesting Russian work that picked it up after that. One of the really cool aspects of this, and there's a whole community, by the way, that story of memory in the synapses is really starting to crack for a number of reasons. Remember, the whole neural net thing is based in synaptic connections, synaptic weights at the connections of the neurons. One of the cool things about the Russian work, there's certain animals that go through larval stages. The Russians were using beetles, beetle larvae. Other people use moths and butterflies. You train the larvae. So here you've got a caterpillar. They live in a 2D world. You train it for a particular task. During metamorphosis, when it goes into its cocoon, it's now in a 3D world, hard body, different controller for running like a caterpillar versus a butterfly. So during that process, the brain is basically dissolved. So most of the connections are broken, most of the cells are gone, and you put together a brand new brain, soft assembled, and you can ask all sorts of interesting philosophical questions. What's it like to be a creature undergoing this massive change? But the information still remains, and so you can ask, certainly for a computer scientist, it's amazing to have a memory that can survive this radical reconstruction. Uh-oh. He goes on. And there's the RNA story. You had mentioned, does this work for mammals? There was a guy in the 70s and 80s, George Ungar, tons of papers. He reproduced it in rats. So his was fear of the dark. By fractionating their brains, he thought it was a peptide, not RNA. Yeah, he just fractionated means they just break it down into all of its constituent chemicals. Not RNA, ends up with a thing called scaraphobin. The claim was you can synthesize it and transfer it from brain to brain. And that's what the thought was. I think David Glanzman favors RNA again. I agree with you. I think that's a super important story of how this information can survive just massive remodeling of the cognitive substrate. In Planaria, what we did, in Planaria, they have a true centralized brain. They have all the neurotransmitters. They are not simple organisms. What we did, like McConnell's first experiments, we trained them on something. We trained them to recognize a laser-etched sort of bumpy pattern on the plate, on the bottom of the dish, and to recognize that that's where their food was going to be found. So the association between this pattern and getting food, and then we cut their heads off. Uh-oh. And we took the tails, and the tails sit there for 10 days doing nothing, and eventually they grow a new brain. And what happens is that information is imprinted on the new brain, and you can recover behavioral evidence that they remember the information. So the new head grows on the plate there, and voila, they're remembering that pattern there means I got a hamburger there. So that's pretty cool because it suggests we don't know if the information is everywhere or on other places in the central nervous system. We don't know where it is yet, but it's clear it can move around. It can move around the body. It can be in posterior half, then imprinted onto the brain, which actually drives all the behavior. So thinking about that, I totally agree that this is a really important rabbit hole for asking. Oh, and by the way, when we looked at morphic resonance in number 43 with Rupert Sheldrake, we saw this story continuously. We don't know where it is. The information moves around. We don't know where it is yet, because they never know where the information is in the brain. It's interesting. So we see why JB is concerned over the things in this rabbit hole, because this is the classic structural problem. Memories persist for decades, yet the nervous system is dynamic, continually changing. And down to the molecular level and beyond, the turnover of all is in a matter of days or weeks. So Francis Crick asked, how is a memory stored so that its trace is relatively immune to molecular turnover. And he had some trying to replace molecule by molecule thing that preserved the memory that everyone would say, nope, that's not going to work. And in reality, no mechanism has been discovered. This is the backdrop that JB is now responding to. He's realizing the fixed hardwired computer architecture with its fixed bits and hardwiring is in deep trouble. If everything can just dissolve and still return somehow later, that is the memories and the knowledge, well, standard computer or neural net architecture is in trouble. And non-standard genius level innovation, whatever, isn't going to help it. So Levin jumps in or continues. So what if you train for things not native to the environment, as opposed to the fear of the dark that seems fairly native? Like 3 light flashes mean move to the left, or you get shocked. So we move to the left, otherwise bad things happen. Now extract the memory in RNA, for example, and move it to another brain. How does the new recipient brain decode this? How does it recognize some crazy hairpin RNA structure as 3 light flashes equal move 3 steps to the left, else you get shocked? Now I'd note, in these discussions, always one has to ask, what is the memory, quote unquote, that is being transferred, quote unquote, via a peptide or an RNA when biologists say this? Because I would say biologists are, to my mind, notorious for not thinking much through about the actual perceptual consequences or understanding of what it is they're talking about. Maybe better, what is the experience? Is it actually that of seeing 3 light flashes and moving 3 steps to the left? I mean, that's all stored on a peptide or an RNA, that experience? I mean, think about this for a second. That's what they're saying, always. Or is it, at the very best, something that simply initiates a motor action? If you got anything at all, without any experience of this past event, that is, okay, maybe there's something in the RNA or in the peptide, but maybe it acts utterly unconsciously to the rat, such that, well, sees a light or 3 lights, but and moves to the left, but there's no memory or awareness other than this action. At best, I for one knew about Ungar back in the 70s, and this is exactly I was writing about this in my PhD thesis. Well, what is it that's actually being transferred? And he goes on, and you can think about it in a different way. Every memory is like a transplanted message from your past self to your future self, meaning you still have to decode them somehow. Whatever those engrams are, you still have to decode them somehow. That's the whole issue of encoding and decoding. Whatever the substrate of memory is one of the most important questions there are. Again, decoding is already the fundamental problem of perception. How you can interpret a code as the world without already knowing what the world looks like. That is, JB is always talking about a code that somehow you're interpreting as representing the outside world, the coffee cup out there. So that's the beginning of the whole problem. And the symmetric side would be then, well, how is memory decoding this to have a memory of the coffee cup out there, or the 3 lights flashing and I better move. And then again, yes, the engrams. We've seen those. A bit later, both note, first, JB, you can read textbooks and never ever hear about these experiments. Everyone who reads intro books on neuroscience only knows about information storage and the connectome. This leads to, given a certain project I didn't catch, probably a connectome mapping project. If RNA That's the base for memory transfer. If that's true, this entire thing is doomed. You cannot get this story, the entire story, out of the connectome. So we've got a bit of a revolutionary flavor going on here at this point. And Levin adds, this is so important in developmental biology. We have the same thing. I tell my students the same thing. Isn't it amazing that in your whole course of developmental biology, there's not a mention of any of this? So, revolution brewing. But it's a lot worse than they realize. Levin is still talking in terms of engrams. But Lashley, we saw, left the concept in shambles. The rats, too, had a behavior. The same thing. They learned to go through a maze and find out which arm had the hamburger. And Lashley tried to eradicate that behavior once they'd learned it. And it didn't matter. The rat could barely crawl, pull himself by his front legs, or use his crutches, whatever. He would still get to the hamburger. Lashley sliced, he diced, he lopped off, he scrambled, he removed the motor cortex, gone. The associative cortex, gone. Various connections, gone. Everything you could think of. And he never could eradicate the memory. This is a vast and celebrated program in the literature of my day, or just before my day, and followed up by another well-known neuroscientist, Roger Sperry. What happened to it? As I noted, no neural net today could withstand Lashley's assault. That nice neural net there, where you're activated on the left side in the black canary and activating the relationship can down in the next row going to the right. That goes through that whole nice new network, and we learn to activate proper response to canary. Canary can grow, move, fly, sing. Well, all those connections, relationships, gone. That neural net and its responses dead in the water. Neural nets were doomed from the get-go. This is not distributed memory. The distribution, the invulnerability to loss, is done some entirely different way. Rupert Sheldrake, we saw, devotes whole books to the phenomenon. Take the rats. If memories are stored in the brain, like our buddy there with his memory of his mom, they should be confined to that brain, and death memory should be gone. If memory is a resident phenomenon, like Sheldrake is arguing, Bergson is arguing, where organisms specifically resonate with themselves in the past, then collective memory, and so an individual memory are the same phenomenon. So in collective memory, the spiders, given their unique architecture, their 6 or 8 legs and their skeletal architecture, etc., are uniquely qualified to resonate such that they can bring back the knowledge of spiders for building webs. So it differs only in degree. Species memory and how to make a web, very complex, very adaptive, we saw in number 26. And then individual memory, again, the canoe reintegrating my experiences of canoeing. A difference in degree. That was Sheldrake's argument. Some validity to that. This can be tested. We're talking the death test here. In fact, it has been tested, we noted. There's a long series of experiments conducted first at Harvard, then at Edinburgh and Melbourne. At Harvard, rats learned to escape from a water maze. The more that learned it, the easier it became for the rest. Interesting already. Then at Edinburgh and Melbourne, the Scottish and Australian rats took up where the Harvard rats left off. Their descendants learned even faster. Soon they got it right the very first time. At Melbourne, rats from untrained parents still showed the same effect. That is, this was not being passed to the genes. It was not being passed through RNA. It was not being passed through peptides. It was, in Rupert's argument, some sort of species, self-similar resonance to this whole knowledge. I mean, it's rather amazing. I mean, all similar rats learn quicker, just as morphic resonance would predict for Sheldrake. This is a kind of a toughie. Rupert, of course, would tend to stuff all of this into morphic resonance, especially the planaria and the regeneration of heads or tails. That is, they're tuning into a morphic field being a field that guides form and the development of form. As I've noted, remember, form and behavior are synonymous, same thing. But Levin, form is just behavior at a molecular atomic level. But Levin is noted for his discovery of bioelectric fields that are involved with form. He discusses these in this discussion in the Planaria case and how he can detect these. And the fields can be nudged, he said, to create two heads. So if the planaria is cut in half, the planaria will grow two heads, or nudged to a different form. That is, if cut again, the planaria can grow round heads. So the morphic field thing hits a snag, namely Levin's bioelectric field. But is the latter the full story? This is interesting. Remember, you've also got to deal with instinct, also a form of behavior. Remember number 46 and number 26. How does the wasp know the precise 9 points in the head twist necessary to sting a caterpillar upon and paralyze it so its young can feed nicely? Or how does a spider know web making? Problems that Levin and JB also have to address. JB cannot stay away from the subject of perception. We already saw in a previous slide that what he's describing is perception, how you see the coffee cup. He's trying to imagine a computational system that can work with all this mushy bio variability. That is, his paradigm is collapsing. To quote, one of the ways we can think about these n-grams, so we haven't given up on the n-grams, the way we see perception seems to be working is that we spawn lots of future controllers that are organized into objects that are controlled at the level of the scene. It's basically like a game engine that is forming in our brain, forming a population of interacting objects that are tuned to attract our perceptual data. Noisy samples that are difficult to interpret, but we are meshing them into these hierarchies of futures that are translated into objects that assign every feature to every one object, and every pixel to, so to speak, to exactly one, except in the case of transparency, and use this to interpret the scene that is happening in front of us. Noisy samples, difficult to interpret there. That's in his one comment. That's the world he lives in. This is the impoverished stimulus, or the environment that Gibson destroyed. The environment is highly specified via ubiquitous invariance laws, texture gradients, velocity flow fields, tau ratios, size constancy ratios, texture gradient. Remember, we've got those nice little texture units, horizontal separation, vertical separation, horizontal size is proportional 1 over d, vertical separation 1 over d squared, ubiquitous fields of grass, gravel driveways, velocity flow fields, again, velocity vectors, field proportional 1 over the distance squared, again, the distance d being distance from the observer's eye, again, ubiquitous, say as we're driving down the road, tau ratios, where we have the tau ratio over those fields, which is specific to the severity of impact, such that this is a piece of information defined over the field that's used by birds to land softly, pilots to land softly on the runway, etc. Size constancy ratio, we're moving the cup across the gradient, and there's a ratio or invariance law, S times N equal K, that is, again, S the size or the height, and the number of texture units occluded. So as the cup's height increases, the number of rows occluded decreases. This is all, there's tons of information in the environment that's specific to distance, the stretching away of the distance, the size constancy, how hard you're going to hit a pavement or whatever. It's just not noisy samples difficult to interpret. JB lives in a world where the study of perception never happened, especially Gibson and ecological psychology. Again, you've got that phrase, objects that assign features to objects. Well, objects are not definable by a set of static features. This is a mythology of the classic spatial metaphysic in which JB works. Noted things like the Gibsonian cube. The features in that rotating cube are discontinuity at the junctures of these flows. As the side rotates towards us, got an expanding flow field. As it rotates away, a contracting flow field. And the edge is simply a sharp discontinuity at the juncture of these two flows, which leads you to things. This is why you get things like strobing a wire edge cube that's rotating. You strobe it out of phase with its symmetry period, which is it maps onto itself every 90-degree rotation, or 4 times per complete revolution. But when we strobe it out of phase, that is 13 times per revolution, we get a plastically deforming, non-rigid object where those features are suddenly not there. But the strobe is a sample at an instant. This is JB's world, a world of instants. But the features do not exist in a static instant. That is, they do not exist in a slice or a frame of time. And JB continues, AI is currently oriented to recognizing images, all disconnected. One system trained via several 100 million images. But a baby does not learn this way, a testament to the power of our statistical methods and the hardware we have. For us, the world is learnable because adjacent frames are correlated. The information gets preserved in the world through time. And we only need to learn the way in which the information gets transmogrified. This transmogrification of information means we have a dynamic world in which the static image is an exception. The identity function is a special case of how the universe changes. Talks of his cat recognizes moving objects easier. It's easier to segment. So how do we represent a moving world as compared to a static world? Again, adjacent frames are correlated. The world is not presented in adjacent frames. The transformation of the universal field is indivisible, a melodic continuity. There are no instants, nor any information in an instant. What you have is we have a dynamic, transforming world where all these invariants over the coffee stirring, radial velocity flow fields, adiabatic ratios, etc., inertial tensors, these invariants exist, but not in an instant, but over an indivisible flow. JB lives in an entirely backwards world. Frame after frame after frame do not need to be transmogrified. It is magically changed into this dynamic scene. It is JB who has transmogrified the world into the classic metaphysic. This world of instant after instant after instant. That is, he thinks the metaphysic is that from which our perceived world derives, but he's wrong. His metaphysic is derived. Its metaphysic is derived by our brain and its cognitive development from the dynamic world given in perception. You cannot start your theory from something derived already in perception. Your theory has to start prior to this. Remember the classic metaphysics. I've known it's an abstract space of points, positions. It's infinitely divisible. The motion of the cup across that continuum or through the 3D continuum between each pair of points, which we consider to describe the motion of that cup. There's another line of points ad infinitum. So because it's infinitely divisible, and we can just make line after line between each pair of points. This is an absurdity. That is, motion is now a set of immobilities and an infinite regress. Each point also corresponds to an instant of time. So what it is an infinitely divisible 4D abstract continuum. It's the basis of all mathematics and JB's AI. So where you have each point corresponds to a frame, we'll call it a cube of the universe, cube after cube after cube, frame after frame. This is JB's frames of the world, the next and the next and the next. But it's completely backwards. Continuing, there's primarily feature changes. An object is composed of features, which may be objects themselves. The scene is a composition of features into a complete set of objects that explain the entirety of the scene. So this explanation of the information, the features, must exist in his perceptual space somewhere. We'll see. So in a static image, these objects don't do anything. They stand in some sort of relationship with each other. These features are classifiers that tell you a feature is a hand or a tool or a foot or a pen, and that's how they relate to the larger scene. But a dynamic scene is not a composition of static features. It's not bits moving around. As he says, the scene is moving. The features are no longer classifiers but operators, and tell you how. Remember, that's why he's going back to how do I get my operators spread out all over the brain, and tell you how the universe or the world needs to change, how your simulation of the universe needs to change to track the sensory pattern. So a feature now is a change operator, transformation, and a feature is a controller that tells you how the bits are moving in your local model of the universe. And these controllers need to be turned on and turned off at the level of the scene. They can move around in the organism until they negotiate a valid picture of reality. So again, all this is an attempt to explain perception, and ultimately it's indirect perception. Somewhere in the brain, somewhere in some undefinable perceptual space or mental space, is this negotiated valid picture of reality. Just remember the opposite view that this series has been putting out. The brain is in a holographic field, embedded in a holographic field. It's a field that's indivisibly transforming, not state to state to state. And so the brain forms a reconstructive wave, specific to an aspect of the field by this process, now an image. Now, what do we mean by specific? If you look at the little holographic reconstruction there, you're having a reconstructive wave passing to the hologram plate, and the object wave now rises to the eye and is specific to its original source, that is, the cup. In the same way, the brain passing through the holographic field, that is the plate, is now specific to a source within the field, the stirring cup, but right where it says it is, external, in the field, not in the brain, not in some perceptual space, not a simulation somewhere. And then we noted it is specified right where it says it is, in the external field. And the brain's wave, this reconstructive wave, is modulated by the invariant structure of the external event. Quite different view that it'd be wonderful if JB would actually consider. So JB realizes how bad this is for current computer architecture. To quote, imagine if you find some computer that is hard disked that are very, very noisy, where the hardware makes lots of mistakes recording things, bits flip and so on. And you find that these computers still work, hypothetically. He notes computer scientists that think you require near absolute reliability, one transcription error, say, in a trillion copies, else your error correction becomes unreliable, inefficient. And they're probably right. Then he says, how would these hypothetical sloppy computers work? You create a virtual structure on top of the noisy structure that is correcting for whatever degree of uncertainty, randomness. Now, one can make a lot of comments on this. I mean, when you really try to analyze it, but I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to note, first of all, a virtual structure is not magic. It's just more code. I mean, generally, actually, a virtual machine does not sit on top of something. It's on the bottom of things. But I know what he's getting at. But he's just talking about a bunch of code that trying to figure out what actually is going on in the outside world, which is going to be amazing. For example, what would be the correction for uncertainty for the strobed and now plastically deforming, not a cube? We're strobing outside of its symmetry group, and the brain obviously likes a constraint. I would say the constraint is that spatial regularity, such as a cube, implies temporal regularity when it's rotating, and the arrhythmic out of the symmetry group phase strobe is ruining this. But is that then a correction for uncertainty? How would he know? The problem is perception has two intrinsic sources of uncertainty already. That is, uncertainty is built in and can't be unbuilt. There's the aperture problem. That is, the eye is an aperture. It's limited, and therefore, by that limitation, the velocities of those flow fields, etc., are inherently uncertain. And secondly, there's time itself, which time, the dynamic transformation of the universal field, the environmental field, the holographic field in Bergson's case, is constant change. No matter how tiny the interval is, constant change. So no determinate values are ever possible. So he's starting from an intrinsic uncertainty that he's simply denying. JB's computer is not processing this information in this dynamic event. It's interesting because a PhD grad student that I've been in communication with, who lives here in Wisconsin, told me the other day, by the way, his name is Scott Wollner, that Jan McGilchrist sort of went off on AI and called it artificial information processing. To which I would say better, AI is artificial information processing. That is, AI is the processing of artificial information. It has nothing to do with the real information that Gibson pointed out that actually exists in the dynamically changing environmental field. Rather, its information is defined by the classic metaphysic, the metaphysic of discrete instants of time, a world in which the brain does not actually dwell. Levin loves listening to JB, the computer scientist, but he's listening to a view that can only lead biology down the wrong track. So, next, we'll see. Till then, signing off.